Hello, everyone, and welcome to Reject Modernity, Embrace Tradition, where we take you back to the good old days, just maybe not how you might expect from our title. I'm Megan Cox.
And I am Clayton Becker.
And Clayton, what are we going to be talking about today?
Well, Megan, today we are bringing you, I think, possibly the nerdiest episode in the history of the podcast, which is we are going to be rejecting inclusionary zoning and embracing social housing. Now, I can tell.
Looking forward to learning what all of those things mean.
Yeah, so I can tell everyone's eyes just glazed over into the back of their skull while they were listening to that. But let me just define a couple of basics here. So first, what is inclusionary zoning? What is social housing? So inclusionary zoning is, in short, requiring or encouraging through various policy incentives, encouraging developers to include a certain number of what are called deed-restricted affordable units in new projects. Now, deed-restricted affordable, this is another term I need to define, is units that are by law, by contract basically, the developer has this contract with the city. By contract, by law, you can only rent them to people making a certain percentage of, this is another term I'm about to need to define, the area median income, which is basically like the income that the median person in that area makes. Now, there are a few ways to define that. Some people use the zip code, some people use the town, some people use the metro area. It depends on the project. But the long story short is you're renting a certain portion of the units in your building to people who only make a certain amount of money, which is a low amount of money. And you are renting those units to those people at a price that they can afford, which is a low price.
So then below market.
Below market rate, yeah.
Okay.
You'll hear me refer to these units as BMR units throughout the episode because it's just easier. That's sort of the parlance that gets used in these particular nerd circles.
And that's just below market rate. BMR is below market rate?
Below market rate, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Different cities have different thresholds for the amount of affordable housing you have to include in new projects, but 15% of units is the most common threshold out there. Other inclusionary zoning programs will include what's called an in lieu fee option, which is basically a developer can choose to pay a fee to the city, and then the city distributes that among nonprofit housing developers instead of the developer choosing to actually provide those units in the building that they are building at that time. Again, there's a lot of sort of like variation in these programs, but that is like the main one. I think actually, let's wait. I'll define social housing when we get to social housing.
Yeah. Let's wait a minute, because like that sounds fine to me as a not housing nerd. Don't we want more affordable units to exist?
Yes. So I have written in my notes here. Now you might be thinking to yourself, "What's the problem with that?" That sounds
was exactly
reasonable,
what I was thinking
right?
to myself.
So there are a couple of wrinkles here that we need to be careful about, that we are often not careful about when we are designing these policies. So the first of these is, I think this is obvious when you think about it, but I think people don't immediately think of it when you say a certain percentage need to be BMR, which is that inclusionary zoning is literally just requiring that developers include unprofitable units in their development. This is, again, maybe something that you don't think is particularly a problem, but this means that inclusionary zoning inherently means that some projects which would pencil economically, they would be profitable to build, do not pencil once you have these inclusionary zoning requirements in place. And when that happens, not only do you not get any additional market rate housing, but you also don't get any additional affordable units either, because the structure just doesn't end up getting built, which means that you're not actually increasing the supply of either types of housing, either market rate housing or below market rate housing. And then second, inclusionary zoning necessarily means that there are not going to be as many market rate units relative to the counterfactual world, the other world, in which the same sized building was built without such requirements. Now, you also might think, what's the problem with this? Well, the reason here is that since below market rate units often, actually mostly, most of the time, do not yield enough rents to cover routine maintenance costs. This means that market rate renters in that building are effectively subsidizing the BMR units. Now, this is, again, something that maybe you're fine with, right? You're like, I'm willing to pay a little bit higher of rents in order to make sure that other people have a place that they can afford. But there are people who can't afford to do that, right? There are people who would be able to afford an apartment on their own without the need for this kind of subsidy that are being forced into other housing because they cannot afford the housing in the new building.
And also, like, I've lived in buildings that had some affordable units in them. No one's ever presented it to a new tenant. Hey, this unit is a little more expensive than an equal unit down the street, but it's because you're subsidizing the affordable units. You're not seeing that information when you're deciding where to live. You're comparing just the apartment in the building with a couple of affordable units and the apartment down the street that costs less.
Yeah.
That's all you're seeing. So you're often not presented with that choice, even if you would make the choice were it presented to you.
Yeah, exactly. And I think another critical thing here is that this screws with a process that we call moving chains, which you'll often sometimes hear called filtering.
Filtering, yes.
Basically, this sounds, I have to preface here, this sounds like just filtering the word, sounds a little bit like the phrase trickle down.
Mm-hmm.
These are not the same kind of process. Filtering is a robust, empirically observed process in housing markets whereby people with the means to do so move into newer housing units, which are typically the more expensive ones, and thereby vacate the housing units that they were previously living in. This does not happen if you don't have enough market rate units, enough new market rate units for those moderate income, above moderate income, wealthier people to move into. Like, these people don't just vanish if you don't have enough new housing units for them. What they end up doing is going and living in the apartment building down the street where people are already living. Right? And so you think to yourself in this scenario, right? Like, okay, well, what's the problem here? But the thing is that people who are already living in that building are basically, by definition, since we're considering those most affluent renters here, less able to pay higher rents. When you have these more affluent people who don't have new housing to move into, they just end up bidding up the rents of existing apartment stock and displacing the people who already live there. That is essentially how you get gentrification, right? Like, when filtering breaks down, when you cannot produce enough housing in a metro area, in a city, for the affluent renters who are moving there, recent college graduates who have jobs in any number of fields, mid-career professionals who are moving for a promotion, when you cannot provision housing for these people directly, they just end up out competing existing residents for the existing space. This is super clear in the housing literature, and reducing the number of market rate units causes that problem to be worse, right?
This sounds like simple supply and demand. I'm not sure why there's so much pushback on this concept.
Well, there's a lot of people who believe that building new housing actually causes rents nearby to go up. People think that there's an induced demand effect. And to their credit, this is not an insane thing to think. Induced demand is a thing that we observe elsewhere, right? But the main thing with induced demand is that we observe it when the thing that is being provisioned in excess, or you're provisioning more, is free to use at the point of service, basically. This is why we see it for roads, right? Roads are free to drive on, with the exception of gas costs, right? So you have induced demand there that often outweighs the supply expansion of the road.
Mm-hmm. This is like you add a lane on the freeway and more people drive because they think it's going to be faster.
Exactly. But the housing literature suggests that if such an effect exists for housing, it is just totally swamped by the first order supply effect, right? Like, the number of people who are induced to move to a new neighborhood by a new nice building being constructed is way fewer than the number of people who would have still chosen to live in that neighborhood and outcompeted existing residents if that building weren't constructed and didn't provide sort of a release valve. The literature, I think, is reasonably clear that building new housing actually helps to forestall and mitigate the impacts of gentrification and displacement rather than intensify them. But back to inclusionary zoning. You can avoid some of these problems, some of these impacts of these two issues that we just went over by having things like incentives for building affordable housing rather than requirements. Things like density bonuses, for example, are quite common. But in practice, lots of these inclusionary zoning ordinances are mandates rather than incentives. They don't allow you to build 20% more units if you include 20% affordable units. They just say you have to build 20% affordable units. And as a result, several studies of these programs and analyses that are sort of like done as policy briefs rather than as academic papers find that poorly designed inclusionary zoning ordinances can actually end up decreasing overall housing production and increasing overall housing prices. For instance, in 2016, San Francisco passed Proposition C, which required market rate projects with 25 units or more to set aside 25% of the units for low-income renters. This had two effects. It meant that people were building a lot of 24-unit buildings, and it meant that a lot of larger projects didn't pencil anymore, right? Mm-hmm. So this made fewer projects economically feasible, leading to a major slowdown in the production of both market rate and deed-restricted affordable units, which was the ostensible purpose of the inclusionary zoning ordinance in the first place. As a result, San Francisco later lowered that inclusionary set-aside to 18%, which a couple of analyses have suggested is the rate at which you get the highest number of deed-restricted affordable units. We might say that that's a goal that we should be going towards. However, I think there are a couple of reasons why that's still a bit suboptimal. Because a huge part of this depends on that threshold for below market rate units, these BMR units. Municipalities will often, as San Francisco did, design these ordinances with the idea being let's achieve the highest number of affordable units. But that's probably not actually the best strategy, because you could get the maximum number of affordable units, but that might not actually be what's the most beneficial for holding down housing prices if for an additional, call it a few hundred affordable units, you're sacrificing thousands of these market rate units that don't get built because of the inclusionary threshold being too high. One recent analysis from researchers at the Lewis Center at UCLA found that for each below market rate unit produced, at the rate that produces the most BMR units, which in their study is about 17%, I think, if I'm remembering correctly, 9 units of market rate housing actually do not get built. So you've got this like 9-to-1 trade-off, right, of affordable housing production to market rate production. And that's probably not actually the trade-off that we want to be making here, because more people are going to end up still gentrifying existing housing stock because you're not providing the requisite number of market rate units for the people who are already going to move to these areas.
All of that makes sense. All of that checks out to me.
Well, I'm very persuasive, and I've done my homework on this.
It certainly seems so, and I think it makes perfect sense. Not only the discussion of filtering, that if you're building the quote unquote luxury units, obviously people are vacating the units that they were in before, and if those units aren't luxury, the price doesn't just go up because there are luxury units now in the neighborhood. And it also makes sense in the context. I think we've been conditioned generally that developers are bad. And
yes. I would say that's a fair assessment.
I mean, I grew up on Fern Gully just like everybody else, and you have a sense that, we should be trying to punish developers, not engage them as partners that are going to help fix the problem.
Yeah, and like to be clear, there are a number of developers who I have interacted with in like doing this advocacy, doing this work, who are like unsavory characters, right? Like it's a non-trivial number of them, but like, you know, they are at least broadly speaking doing something that is like a productive use. They're not like landlords, for example, who, you know, like very much are, you know, I would say more unsavory characters on average, and who are like basically just rent seeking for the most part, which
Literally rent seeking.
Literally rent seeking, both in the term of art way and in the not term of art way. But to just, I want to like make this process of filtering clearer to people. I'm gonna like, instead of going through sort of like the academic jargon here, I'm just gonna take you through like a scenario, right? So I want you to imagine a new building, fancy building. Doesn't matter sort of what city you're in. Imagine like the fancy housing that's going up in the city now. This building has things like elevators, it's got a pool, it's got in-unit laundry, it's got 2 parking spaces, it's got central air, maybe it's got like a gym facility, and it's also got this like nice rooftop deck where there's like a communal grill that you can use, right? This is not like out of the ordinary for a lot of these new sort of quote unquote luxury developments, but it's got amenities, basically, is what I'm trying to say. People who have more money want to move into this building. Right, it's got nice stuff. You know, people who are living in what might be, by their standards at least, sort of below standard housing, are going to choose to move into these buildings if they are available. You hear people say all the time that like, oh, these buildings are all just sitting vacant. Like, no, they're not. We have really good data on this, and they're like 90 to 95% occupied. Right, like they are not sitting vacant.
I can't imagine. No.
Yeah, like I don't know where this narrative came from, but the idea that you have just like, you know, thousands upon thousands upon thousands of like luxury units, luxury buildings just like totally sitting empty is just totally not true. People with means do typically move into these buildings. Like they just do.
And landlords are not dumb, and if they are not renting units, there is a difference between the amount that they must rent a unit for and the amount that they are trying to rent a unit for. And they will reduce the price rather than having something sit vacant.
Yeah, people think that you, this is another thing that I don't know where it came from. People think that landlords are allowed to write off vacant units on their taxes. They are not allowed to do this. The IRS is super explicit that you can deduct like ordinary maintenance costs while a unit is sitting vacant, but you cannot deduct uncollected rent on your taxes. That is totally 100% illegal for you to do. Don't know where this narrative came from. The IRS is like super clear about it right on their fucking website. But it's just not true.
Okay, all right.
So I want you to imagine, so that this like wealthy couple or whatever, these like sort of new upwardly mobile people, they move into this new building. Yeah, yuppie folks, they move into this new building. The building they were living in before is a little less nice, right? You know, some people maybe trading down, some people maybe are coming from out of state or whatever, but most moves are local, and most of the people who are moving into new construction are trading up. So let's just assume they're moving from this building in the city to a new nice place, right? Let's say their old building was built in the 1980s. It's a walk-up. It's got a laundry room. Still has central air, maybe, but it's got like no pool, new rooftop access, only 1 parking space. Maybe that parking space is like underground, right? They've got a below-building parking garage. This building has rents that are not as high as the ones in the previous building. So someone with slightly less income, let's say it's like a marketing manager who's a few years out of school, you know, for some sort of consumer brand, moves into that vacated apartment. But then that person is vacating yet another apartment, right? Let's say the apartment that they're vacating is, for Los Angeles, this would be like a dingbat, right? Very quintessential Los Angeles architecture, 2 or 3 stories over at ground level parking. If you haven't seen these buildings, they're very 1960s, right? 1950s and 60s. You'll see them in a lot of movies from the period. This is like, basically, I'm describing my apartment to you right now. Laundry room, one parking space underneath the cantilever, wall AC. It's a less nice building. You're actually prohibited from going on the roof in my building. The person who moves into that vacated unit is, let's say, a graduate student, moving into a 2-bedroom apartment with their, like a roommate, someone else in there. in their cohort or whatever. The people who we said in the episode from a couple of weeks ago were moving into an apartment that didn't have a refrigerator. Mine does, but for the sake of argument, you understand. And so that person is vacating another unit, and so on down the line, basically, until the units that are like affordable and available to people like waiters, construction workers, janitorial staff, etc., are vacated. This is what a moving chain looks like, and it is like an empirically observed process. The end result of these moving chains, as one study from the Journal of Urban Economics estimates, is that constructing a new market rate building that houses 100 people ultimately leads to 45 to 75 people moving out of the lowest income neighborhoods, lowest income census tracts, freeing up those units for lower income renters. So when you're missing out on these market rate units at a 9-to-1 ratio, you're trading in what is often called naturally occurring affordable housing for affordable housing that is new and purpose-built, but much less of it, in effect. That's what you're doing. That's what's happening.
That makes a ton of sense. I think maybe a mistake that people are making when they're thinking about this is just considering driving down prices, where in fact all of these people, even if they pay the same rent as the person who vacated before them, they are getting more for what they were paying. They now are able to afford a better place at the same rate,
Yeah. And when this happens across thousands of new apartments that are constructed in a city, right? Across thousands of households, thousands of renters, it does actually exert a downward impact on prices. This is another thing that the literature, I think, is reasonably clear on.
We've seen this very clearly in Austin, haven't we?
Yeah. Rents in Austin have fallen quite a bit, principally as a result of the huge expansion in the number of apartments that they've built there. Other places that you've seen it are Minneapolis, and then Seattle still has increasing rents in nominal terms, but I believe over the last number of months, Seattle has seen decreasing rents in real terms, because even if rents are going up in nominal terms, they're going up slower than inflation and slower than wages. So you're actually able to spend less as a percentage of your income for the same space. And the literature is pretty clear on this, that the effects of any given building are pretty small, but multiply it out across thousands of units, hundreds of buildings, and you do actually see a marked decrease in the rents that get charged. So that's the policy problem of inclusionary zoning. It's a trade-off that I don't think actually achieves its goals. But I think there's a more sort of fundamental mindset problem here, that you sort of alluded to earlier, Megan, of the conditioned to hate developers and want to punish them. The fundamental mindset change that I want to talk about here is just the nature of inclusionary zoning as a type of what we call value capture, versus just viewing housing as a public benefit in and of itself. So again, this is another term that I need to define, but value capture, the idea behind value capture is that cities, when they allow more development, are creating value. And most of that value, if the city does nothing else other than allow for the construction of that building, will go to the developer. The idea being here that the people who are going to live in that building are not going to derive any benefit from it, I suppose. But the city can, in this telling, take additional steps to capture some of the value that it has created and make sure that it is used for the public benefit. Translated into policy, then, this often means that cities should only make it easier to build additional housing, additional market rate units, enabling that private game, if they also are willing to build some low income units at the same time, which are seen as a public gain more so than the market rate units, for reasons that are not understandable, but which I do find slightly logically internally inconsistent, right? The idea that it's only a public benefit if it's below market rate units is a little strange to me. And translated more specifically into inclusionary zoning, cities are basically saying you should only be able to build this new housing if you contribute money towards the public benefit that is affordable housing. This, in my view, is like a complete inversion of how we should be thinking about funding affordable housing and solving the housing crisis. The motivating logic here behind inclusionary zoning is that new housing is not a public benefit in and of itself, which is a little strange to me. Again, not understandable. I do understand how people think this way, but I think if you take a little bit more time to think about the actual like underpinning logic of new houses for people to live in are not a public benefit, you'll see how that is actually a little bit internally inconsistent. Similarly, I would argue conventional value capture here is just completely backwards because it targets development. It targets the thing that we want more of it, right? Even though the problem it wants to solve is caused by development's absence. Like the literature is super clear on this, that the fundamental cause of the housing crisis is that there are not enough housing units to go around. We've spent the last 15 years just dramatically underbuilding housing in the United States.
It sounds to me like, just as an analogy here, when you were like a teenager or something, if you like to spend a lot of time in your room and then one evening you decided to come down and watch a movie with the family and your parents like, oh, look who decided to join us. And you're like, not going to do that again.
Yeah, exactly.
Like,
right.
That's what we're doing to developers, more or less. Like, it's not enough that like you are doing the thing that we want you to do by building more housing. So should you be rewarded for that or punished?
Yes, exactly. Right. And so I think that what this logic of inclusionary zoning does is it mistakes development as the true source of value, when at least in urban areas, the actual real value lies in land. It lies in the location. By taxing development rather than by taxing land, this conventional value capture pits two groups of people who, like, by definition are ameliorating housing scarcity, developers of market rate housing and developers of affordable housing, against each other, while basically sort of like under the table protecting through this like implicit subsidy by not taxing land the vast majority of landholders who are content to let housing scarcity just keep on going because they want their property values to increase, because scarcity increases the value of that scarce commodity. Mm-hmm. It taxes the action that we most want to incentivize and rewards the inaction that is causing our problem. It's completely backwards, right? By doing what is in effect taxing productive activity as a way to capture value, rather than taxing this rent seeking in the form of like the land appreciation, we decrease the production of valuable housing and don't actually end up putting sufficient resources towards the construction of sustainable, affordable housing models.
Okay.
So with that in mind, what should we be doing instead? We will tell you right after the break. We're going to be embracing affordable housing, and when we come back, I will explain exactly what that is. Hello again, everyone. When we left you, I was, quite frankly, losing my mind a little bit, as I often do on these episodes where we talk about housing-related topics.
Yeah, you're very passionate about housing.
Very passionate about it. But I was just about to tell you why, instead of inclusionary zoning, we should embrace social housing. So first and foremost, I think I should probably explain like what these social housing models are, and then sort of like specifically why we should prefer them over inclusionary zoning.
Yeah. Honestly, like when you first, proposed this and looking through the notes, my immediate question is, have we addressed some of the drawbacks that many of us observed or have heard about in terms of public housing projects? Public housing in the US and in a lot of Western Europe doesn't have a great reputation.
Yeah.
What is this different, and if so, how?
Yes, I'm glad that you asked, Megan. This offers me a perfect opportunity to tell you exactly how social housing is different. So, social housing models, modern social housing models, are frankly like a direct response to the failure of these types of older public housing models. I'll explain, I guess, first. Like, there are sort of like three things that made public housing in the United States and Western Europe not like great, right? Like the reasons that we stopped building them and the reason that we demolished a lot of it, right?
Yeah, you think about your Cabrini Greens or some of your council estates in London that just are not great places.
Yeah,
or were not great places. I believe Cabrini Green was demolished.
Yeah, Pruitt-Igoe is another one of the big versions of this. It's also been torn down. It was torn down, I think, in the like mid 1970s, if I'm remembering correctly. So there were basically three main problems. The first of these problems, and I think probably the like biggest one, is that the federal government in the United States, at least, which is why I'm most familiar with this, provisioned money to build these public housing units, but then did not provision any ongoing funds for their upkeep and maintenance. And one of the drawbacks of 100% affordable housing, just generally, one of the challenges, I suppose I should say, that you have to deal with, is that the rent that you can charge in affordable units, especially at certain income thresholds, it's not enough money to cover the costs of even just routine maintenance. So especially in these very big public housing projects like Cabrini Green, like Pruitt-Igoe, you had things like elevators that would break and wouldn't be repaired. Light fixtures would break in the hallways and they wouldn't be replaced. Trash pickup wouldn't happen. I think one of the most infamous statistics here, I'm not sure if I'm getting this entirely right, is that like 13 floors in Cabrini Green were filled with trash.
The trash chute backed up 13 floors is the story that I heard. Yeah.
Because, they weren't picking up the trash regularly, right? So that's the first thing. The second thing that caused the sort of failure of these older public housing models is, the concentration of poverty is just, it's really bad, right? You're putting a bunch of people together that like don't have the means to support themselves in sort of a market rate context. And the research is just really, really clear that all of the like deleterious effects that poverty has at an individual scale are magnified when you concentrate poverty in a single area. So when you have these, 20-story buildings that are just like concentrating poverty far beyond anything that like actually happens, quote unquote, naturally, right? It's actually like worse than the kind of concentrated poverty, or it can be worse, I suppose I should say. Don't want to make too strong a claim here. It can be worse than the concentrations of poverty that happen in like urban slums, for example, which are very dense, right? But at least people typically have sometimes like their own like individual spaces, even if they're quite small. And then the third thing is, we got to go back to our old friend racism, which is just like, there were public housing projects that were built, that were smaller, that were open primarily to white residents. And then over time, those projects were allowed to be purchased by people who were living in them at below market rates. And that was only available to white folks. And in a mid-century America that, probably I would say, hopefully, I would say, even more so than today, was not exactly great at offering opportunities for people who were not white, career opportunities and otherwise, to escape poverty traps. That meant that the only public housing units that were left had this both concentrated disadvantage in the form of race and class, which meant that the relevant governing bodies that could have done something about these deteriorating conditions were just not particularly motivated to do so. And so social housing emerges as a response to that problem. And modern social housing models focus on mixed income models. This is the primary way that social housing differs from the kind of public housing that we built in the mid-century, right, in the 50s through the 60s. These public housing units that we built earlier were designed to be 100% deed restricted affordable units, and that is really what like made their death knell, right? It's a mixed income model that is much more sustainable and much better in the long run. This is basically analogous in the inclusionary zoning case to the subsidies that you get from the market rate rents, subsidizing the below market rate rents. The same sort of mechanism happens in social housing. And social housing programs, the modern type, exist today in many European countries. The most successful of them, most successful example that I think people are aware of at least, is in the city of Vienna in Austria. And then we have a moderately successful program, which is a small program, here in the United States in Montgomery County, Maryland. They have roughly, I think it's like $50 million revolving fund that makes loans, basically, and retains some control over the developments. We'll talk about more of exactly how this works a little bit later. But that's essentially sort of how social housing differs from what in the United States we know as public housing. It's focused on financial sustainability, and it's focused on not concentrating poverty in one specific area.
You almost have a social subsidy as well as a financial subsidy by creating that kind of mixed income development at that point.
Yeah, and a lot of the benefits these mixed income developments can provide is that they can provide like more access to opportunity. They're often built in somewhat higher resource areas than the original public housing projects were built, which are closer to things like good schools, closer to things like good job opportunities, things like amenities, like parks, restaurants, shops, you name it, right? So now that we've talked about social housing just a little bit, defined what it is and how it's different from public housing, I want to talk just very briefly about land value taxes, which is how I'm going to propose that we fund all of this.
Okay.
We went over it a little bit in the top half. I sort of mentioned that the real value in cities lies in land, but we want to talk more specifically about exactly what a land value tax is and how it works. So we have talked about land value taxes before on this podcast. We talked about it in our episode with Nia Johnson on rejecting sprawl. If you want to go listen to it more in detail, you can go listen to that episode. But in short, land value taxes are taxes that are assessed against the value of the land that structures are built on, rather than on the value of the structures themselves. This land value tax idea comes out of the work of the late 19th century economist Henry George, who actually nearly won the 1886 New York City mayor's race. And I sometimes get a little sad thinking about what could have been.
Imagine that alternate history.
Imagine that alternate history, for real. This specifically, it comes out of his best known work, which was a bestseller in the United States, but has largely been forgotten in the modern world, called Progress and Poverty, that looks at how you can have such wealth generation through the Industrial Revolution, combined with such inequality and such like abject poverty that existed in American cities at the end of the 19th century. You can sort of think of George, I would say, as maybe a counterpart to Marx. He came a little bit later, and he has slightly different policy prescriptions, slightly different ideas of how we should operationalize various things. But they share this common understanding of we're seeing a lot of poverty amid plenty, right? And so the way that George's prescription here works is that the intuition behind it, at least, is that, unlike property taxes, unlike taxing development itself, we should tax the value of the land under it. We should capture the value in that way. We should capture what are called the land rents that accrue to people who own land, which are basically, I think we can sort of say, like through no real action of their own, right? Like you could imagine at least, right, that someone owning a property, right, and taxing property they could have at least had a hand in why that property is more valuable. Maybe
they might be adding improvements.
Yeah, they're adding improvements. They've added, say, solar panels. They redid the kitchen. Maybe they like just built the house, right? As was common, you know, in previous centuries, people would just build their own houses. My dad grew up in a house that his dad just built, right? And for
you can just do things.
Yeah, and for the first year in that very little tiny rural town where they all lived, he built the basement first, obviously, because you got to build the basement first. They all just lived in the basement before he had finished the top of the house. You know, he wasn't alive at this time because he was never 9 out of 10 children. But he heard the stories and he relayed the stories to me. But anyway, but so you can think of like, there's nothing that you're really doing as a property owner to make the land itself become more valuable. Unless, of course, you know, you're like doing a 1978, like Lex Luthor, we're going to target the San Andreas Fault with nuclear weapons kind of thing, in order to increase the value of my land holdings, right? Unless you're doing that, you're probably not unilaterally increasing the supply of your land. And so since you didn't have any hand in creating that value, you shouldn't get to extract it, right? That value should belong to the state. It should belong to the municipality, and we should use that value to do things with, right? Similarly on this, since the supply of land is more or less fixed outside of like land reclamation efforts, which I don't know, we could talk about it. Maybe someone will write a paper that looks at whether land value taxes disincentivize land reclamation. Taxing land does not result in more or less land being created, right? You don't change the supply of land if you choose to tax it in the way that
there's no behavioral implication.
Yes, there's no behavioral implications. And so it doesn't impact the price of land. I can tell I'm monologuing a bit here. So the TLDR is basically that land value taxes are like a perfect tax. They don't change behavior. There's no deadweight loss. And they actually incentivize the productive use of land. And as an added benefit, they're basically impossible to like skirt or avoid. Like you can't really get out of paying land value taxes. So it's very difficult for people who are, you know, like well endowed with land resources to sort of be like, oh, well, I'm just going to tax it. I'm going to hide my income as capital gains. You can't hide land as anything else, right? So it's very, very hard to avoid paying, which is good. Now you might ask yourself, I don't know, Megan, if you were asking yourself, hey, now, you know, that sounds a lot like those 15% inclusionary requirements you mentioned in the first half, and you told us those were bad. So what's the difference here? Like, what gives? What are you telling me? What are you doing here? I don't know if you were thinking that, Megan. I don't want to impute that to you.
Well, Clayton, I did read the notes, so many of my questions have been answered already.
I gotta maintain at least a little bit of an illusion, Megan. You know, I gotta maintain gotta maintain it for the audience.
Anyway, if I had not read the notes, I absolutely would have been asking myself, hey, how are these things different?
Wow, look at me, how good I am at projecting what the questions people will have are going to be. Anyway, okay, so the difference here is that in social housing models, the state is either actively building housing itself, or, as is more common these days, actively subsidizing private developers that they partner with. This is how Vienna does it. Like, Vienna does not build any housing itself anymore. It just partners with these private developers, rather than essentially taxing. And the key way that this happens is that a social housing authority will provide either zero interest or very, very low interest loans to developers who build these mixed income projects. The developers then pay back those loans at the either zero or very low interest rate costs, and the social housing authority maintains some form of ownership or operating authority over the project. Oftentimes, the way that you'll see this happen is that the social housing authority will have like a member on the board of whatever organization is, running that development. Whatever the property manager is, they'll have like veto power over the decisions, say. Or there are a couple of other models, but I don't want to make things even more complicated than I've already made them. And given prevailing interest rates, especially interest rates being high right now, and especially given the higher interest rates that get charged on riskier projects that include below market rate units, the public financing can save hundreds of thousands of dollars in project costs for any given building.
I haven't even thought about the finance issues. If you are saying voluntarily you are not going to be making a profit on this, and this unit, in a building, that's got to create significant issues.
Yeah, those
this what a system. Okay.
Yeah, those financing costs they're not the biggest cost, right? In developing housing, like materials and labor costs are the most important. They are the biggest,
but it is making it harder.
But at the margins, yeah. But at the margins, if you can save a few $100,000 on a project, or on a larger project, if you can save $1 million in financing costs, that makes a lot of projects that would not pencil. Which means that many developments that wouldn't get built under traditional financing schemes now can get built, right? And so instead of actively disincentivizing development through these inclusionary zoning mandates, which results in less housing getting built, both market rate and below market rate, you get more of both because you are providing better, more sure, less costly financing to housing developers in exchange for them building these below market rate units. This is another kind of incentive, you could think, but it's not a requirement, right? And it doesn't actually disincentivize any of the market rate construction that you might have. And so my proposal here is very simple. We should do land value taxes, which are much more efficient, much better than property taxes. And I think a more fair way of taxing like property wealth than taxing property itself, and divert at least a substantial portion of that revenue to funds that build social housing. This is my policy prescription here. We've gotten to it nearly 20 minutes into the back half of the episode, but I needed to explain a bunch of things. If I were a pure Georgist, which I'm not, I would say that land value taxes should basically be the only kind of tax that we implement in society. This is like the pure Georgist position. But I think that, a either revenue neutral or somewhat revenue positive shift from property taxes to land value taxes provides revenue that we should be using to build these kinds of social housing projects. Because in the same way that I think that the literature is relatively clear that building market rate housing helps, all the stuff we mentioned up at the top, first half of the episode, I think that there is very little evidence to suggest that even these processes of filtering and moving chains and all of that can provision the needed housing that we require for very, very low income people. People who are making, call it 10%, 20%, 30% of area median income. For whatever reason, right? Maybe they can only hold down a part-time job. Maybe they are disabled in some way. Maybe they have caregiving responsibilities that mean that they simply cannot hold down a job that pays them a substantial amount of money, right? There are many reasons why this might be. And so you should purpose build at least some housing for these folks, right? And I think that social housing models are the best way of doing that.
Yes.
I think that the logic of social housing, if you think through it, is pretty clear and undeniable. You've got a revolving fund for money. That means that you get to keep using essentially the same $50 million, $100 million, $200 million, depending on how big you want to make the program, to build more and more housing units time and again. When you use that money to build 100% affordable housing, or to build public housing, or to maintain public housing, it's gone, right? It's the government doesn't have it anymore. When you use it to build social housing, you get that money back, and you can then turn it right around and build more housing units. So you actually end up, even though it takes a little bit longer, you end up with more units of affordable housing in the long term than if you just put that money directly into a 100% affordable housing development, which, as we've already talked about, has some problems and some challenges that you need to overcome that social housing just doesn't really have to deal with, because it's a much more sustainable model. I have, a few things that I've written in the notes, I guess, that I just want to make sure I hit. These models just do multiple things that I think are fundamentally better than inclusionary zoning, while achieving, I would argue, better than inclusionary zoning mandates, basically all of the same goals. It actively incentivizes more housing construction rather than the reverse. It encourages productive land use because, if the land is going to get taxed regardless at the same rate, you might as well do something with it.
Right? You're not going to let things sit vacant for no reason.
this is another sort of benefit of land value taxes that I didn't go into because it's in the other episode. But like they incentivize productive land use, right? Because you're not going to be like punished, quote unquote, in effect for building something on the land, right? Your tax bill is not going to go up if you do something with that like vacant lot that you have, or, you know, the parking lot that you've got. So you might as well do something a little bit more productive with it. It is just, as I've been going over, it's way more financially sustainable than this 100% affordable housing model. And once built, it does not typically require ongoing subsidies from the state or the municipality or the social housing authority. Meaning that the money you put into that revolving fund can be used to build housing as opposed to just maintaining it. And then last but not least, it helps to address that class and race-based segregation that we were talking about, both with prior public housing models and with even contemporary, you know, 100% affordable housing developments.
Or quite frankly, I would think all market rate, quote unquote, housing. You know, you still have some significant, I mean, definitely class effects, but also racial effects and segregation in our current kind of free market housing free for all. And the negative impacts of that, so long as we continue to rely on property taxes for education funding in this country, are really significant. One of our earliest episodes in this podcast was about how housing costs and selecting for the quote right school can influence people to be financially stretching themselves much more than they're comfortable. If we're creating these deliberate kind of mixed income developments and neighborhoods, that's also really going to change the incentives around selecting locations for your child's education.
Yeah, I mean, it's just another win for the housing theory of everything, right?
Yes.
I mean, it really does come down to people need a place to live, right? And
also, we want people to have places to live.
And we want people to have, yes.
If you've ever walked past a homeless person and felt uncomfortable, you want that person to have some place to live.
Yes, you do. Like, or, I mean, like, at least we do, right? There are some people who I imagine would be just fine with them being elsewhere, right?
Elsewhere is a house, dude.
Yeah. Or,
that is the best possible elsewhere. Let's get them into a good elsewhere.
Yes, the best possible elsewhere. It's like probably a good title for a book, quite frankly. The best possible elsewhere. I got to write that down. But what it really does come down to is people need places to live, and we want people to have places to live. There are all sorts of negative impacts that result from people not being able to move to like the right housing for them, people not being able to move to the right like area for them, the right part of the country, right? There's a whole slate of stuff that we haven't talked about here around like people who are, you know, trans trying to escape red states right now. You know, pregnant women trying to like not live in places where you have like near total abortion bans, right? Like all of this relies on people having space, having a place to stay, having a place to live. And as much as we just need more new housing writ large, I think it is critically important that we fund the development of affordable housing in the best way possible. And I think that the way to do that is not by pitting developers of market rate and affordable housing against each other, not by mandating that if developers want to build market rate housing, they need to include a certain amount of affordable housing, but by, quite frankly, ponying the fuck up and using the resources of the state to actually fund housing construction in a way that is financially sustainable, solves the problems that we're talking about, and provides a secure financial footing for both the housing authority and the people who are going to live in those developments. Like, again, this is a thing. I get passionate when we talk about the housing episodes.
Always consistently.
Always. But
how much will Clayton yell today? Is it about housing?
Yeah, direct correlation, right? All right. Recentering myself here for the end of the episode here. All right.
It's completely reasonable because, I mean, we joke around about the housing theory of everything, but so much of our current political discontent is based around whether or not you can afford housing and whether or not your housing, if you have it, is your primary investment vehicle. And there are very clearly like bad results from that being the basis on which people are deciding what politicians or political parties they adhere to. And so we should maybe do something to mitigate not only housing costs that we see, but also people's discontent more generally.
I would agree.
Thank you.
I will try
I'm very smart.
Trying not to get too animated about it. I agree with you, Megan, wholeheartedly.
Thank you.
Long story short, everyone, social housing is good, actually. And rather than instituting these inclusionary zoning mandates, which I gotta be honest, sometimes feel like cities just want to make believe that they are addressing the affordable housing need, while not actually needing to put any state or city resources into solving the problem.
Easy button.
Yeah, they're pushing the easy button. They're getting out of it politically while not actually addressing the issue. And I think that, like I said, at a certain point, you got to be willing to actually put the just absolutely massive financial resources of the state towards building affordable housing for people who need it. And if we can convince you of nothing else, I think it would be that once we have agreed politically to do that, once we have told ourselves, convinced others that it is worth putting the resources of the state behind this, the proper way to do that is through funding social housing. Ideally, if you want to do it using a land value tax, more power to you. I love you. Please read Progress and Poverty. If not, just put more resources there anyway. Another way. Anyway,
whatever money you got, we'll take whatever money you got.
Literally, quite literally. But until I manage to convince you of those things, until we do all of the things we talked about in this episode, and until we manage to meaningfully address the need for affordable housing in our communities, in our cities, in our states, and in our nation, I have been Clayton Becker.
I have been Megan Cox.
And we will see you guys on the next one.